And just like that, we're nearing the end of the Business of Data Festival Summer Edition 2022. So thank you so much for joining us, but don't leave just yet, because we are now going to be talking about best user cases of data visualization, and we are joined by two fantastic experts to chat about, amongst many things, I hope, what value can excellent visualization provide and what can happen if we don't get this right. Now, welcome both of you, although someone has just dropped out. So at the moment, I just have Axel with me. So I'm going to direct this straight to you and get you to introduce yourself to our lovely audience. You and your role would be great.
Hi, Mariana. Thanks for the intro, and hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Axel Goris. I'm the Global Visual Analytics Lead at Novartis. And my background is before I joined Novartis 2.5 years ago, mostly in consulting, in different areas, different industries, um, finding better ways of doing BI with with newer tools, different, more agile, more user-centric methodologies. My academic background is, for a long time, didn't used to be very relevant, but it's very relevant now. I've got a background in cognitive science and specifically cognitive ergonomics, at least that's what it was called. Nowadays, you would call it more something like AI-assisted UX. So it took a while, probably about 25 years or so, to become relevant to what I do.
25 years, but here you are. David, I'm glad you are back. I've just asked Axel to introduce himself and his role, so I will let you do yours now.
Thank you. Sorry. Yes, I'm David. I lead the data visualization team at Expedia Group. I've been with Expedia for about 3 years. Before that, I worked in consulting for a number of years around BI, and before that in analytics across banking, particularly retail banking. So yeah, it's been quite a few years, but for the best part of like the last 3 years have been all about travel.
Well, it's great to hear that both of you have come from such different areas, but here we are talking about the same thing today. And big question now to start off with, but let's get into it. So, what are your best use cases of data visualization? Who's going to take this on first?
Axel, do you want to do the honors?
Sure. I mean, maybe, I want to start off because often what you see is a lot of focus on what it looks like, is it pretty or not? And, in many cases, actually, it's nice, but it's not really what makes a great visual analytics app. What I usually want to ask is, 3 questions. The first one is it relevant to the user? Because often you see that there's a one-size-fits-all approach, which is still sort of a remnant from the old BI reporting. So, you have a report with data and that's what you share. And then anyone who wants that data takes that report, but it's not relevant to the user always. The second one is, does it draw attention where attention is needed? Because, you got lots of colors, moving objects, or, whichever, lots of things going on. But does it help the user to quickly see where he needs to look? And then the final thing is it actionable? Because ultimately, if it doesn't lead to an action, so what?
Mm-hmm.
And you get the value only if people take action based on the data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. But I was thinking, I think the best use case is the one that gets used. Uh, there isn't much point sometimes in kind of creating things that are very complex, or even if they're not complex, it's just creating a lot of objects or visualizations that if they don't get the usage that is required. And I think your last point touches on that is, are we seeing the end users actually using it and coming back to it and taking action on what they are seeing? So yeah, I would agree with that for sure.
So I guess the next question then would be, what is actually making these things successful? Are you noticing maybe patterns? And it would be very interesting actually to hear your comparisons with one another.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can take that one, just so we can. It's not you again. So a couple of things that I've seen. We've been trying to focus more around think about visualizations as products, that evolve in the same way that any product would evolve. So you start from iteration and you have version one, but then the business shifts, the product shifts with the business. Rather than, I think I've seen countless situations where we built something and then the business moves, but we don't adapt. And then we feel a little bit like, why is no one using it? Because the business has evolved and the visualizations have not. So we try to take a very product focused approach to it, building fewer things with better quality that are um, focusing on that user, but also bringing everyone like really close together. A very specific thing that we do is to double down on wireframing. So let me try to explain, and I'm sure Axel, you've seen this before. Between the time that you agree with a potential stakeholder or business partner about where you're going to go and build, and the time that the actual data is made available, it could be a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, by which time they have moved on or they are thinking about something else. So one of the areas I've been focusing a lot is fairly shortly after those meetings have really good wireframes that users can provide feedback on, and they can almost break so they can click on things and it feels almost like the end product. And what we've seen is that one, they are more candid with their feedback because there's less pressure on. We've had developers working on this for the past 2 weeks, and we don't have anything to lose, right? We can bin that, start afresh, and you can go it again. Like you don't have anything to lose in that situation. Ultimately, what that has translated into is that our users get more attached to the product because they feel like they are creating it with us rather than us creating it somewhere else and then bringing it to the front.
It's a really interesting point, and I totally agree that a product approach works much better for these things because you're never done. It's always in motion, and almost always, well, basically, if you deliver the first sort of things that a user might want to look out for, they get more mature. Their skill in and data literacy goes
Mm-hmm.
up, so they'll start asking for more things. And of course, there's more data. The business continuously changing. So it's, in the old approach where delivery was always done as a big bang. You invest huge amounts of money, you deliver, and then you're done, and you leave it. You're done for the next 5 to 10 years. The interesting thing is that that approach also drives a very different behavior from your stakeholders because they think, oh my God, we have this window of opportunity to get stuff done and get data in and accessible. So they start thinking about anything that they could possibly want in the future. And usually that leads to terrible design where there's just far too much going on and where you leave everything open and up to the user, and you can see from what iPhone did and the impact that iPhone had, taking away all the options for the user, just go with what's most likely the default preference. And, that's completely out the window. But if you take a productized approach where, you have the security for the users that they know if it doesn't come this time, it'll come the next sprint, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're in charge of prioritizing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that drives a much better behavior um, and more consideration for what is really the priority to put in now.
Absolutely.
I was going to say, do you then, and this is for both of you, but do you find yourself then having to constantly check in to what you're doing to make sure you're always making these adjustments?
I think because the way that we operate, the the business partners or stakeholders are in constant contact with us. We're trying to keep on top of those changes, and we also have prioritization sessions, whether that's a steering meeting where we propose a series of next steps, but we also open the room for any any stakeholder to challenge based on where the business is going. So we're always open for someone to come up and say, you know what, I know we talked about that last month, but that's no longer the first priority. Here's what the first priority is. Maybe we should go after this, and we can go through those discussions. And I think it's because in my experience, BI at some point became a little bit detached from the strategy of the business. It felt like it was always lagging. Um, and it lags because there's too much separation sometimes between what the business is doing and what the development side was doing. So having that opportunity, like productionize and be very close, I think it feels like it's easier to change and to sometimes just pivot direction based on where the business is going, which I think particularly in times like these, it's important.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, within Novartis, we've got a number of different models for delivery. We've got what we call business managed, also called self-service, where we provide the platform, some automated testing, automated quality assurance tools, and training enablement, but we don't deliver. The business is responsible for delivering for themselves or hiring local parties that support them in the delivery. So that way, they're the benefit is that they've got complete control, autonomy, and agility as much as they want because they're in charge. They can deploy whenever they want. But of course, there's some guardrails to what they can do, and it has to fit within a lower risk profile. But that's where they can then maximize their investment and be in control. Doesn't always lead to the best solutions and best experiences. So we also have the what we call IT delivered model, and that's where our teams would actually manage the delivery and the ongoing support. But that's also, and how that is set up, it could be set up as a productized sort of approach where it's an ongoing delivery where the development team also provides the ongoing support, or it's more of you deliver once, you put it in live, and then you use it. But that depends a little bit on the business, what their vision is with how they want to drive data literacy and get to a data-driven organization.
Axel, I want to go back to a point you made very early on in this conversation, that you started off in a very different area. And I think I'm kind of very interested now in sort of whether that element of your, let's say, career has actually helped you in data visualization now.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the content that I looked at also had to do with what you nowadays would call user experience. So it's UI design, user experience design, and how you would use AI to make your user interface aware of user objectives. And that sort of always stuck with me, that the first thing you look at is who is your user, what are their objectives, and in their context. So, what is the process that they're part of? So I always want to understand what the users do and what their context is, what they're responsible for. Because if you don't understand that, you can never really design something that suits them, to their needs and to their context. And if I look at later stage when design thinking became a thing, I had the luck that with the consulting company I worked with, we had really good design thinkers. So I sort of learned a lot from working with them, and started to develop a methodology on driving the design. And if you abstract what we there do with the UX researchers, UI designers in those workshops, we really think about what I call the sort of a triangle between the persona, the metrics, and the dimensions. So which define the granularity, the drill downs you get from the data. And often people only look at the last part, so the metrics and the dimensions, which is your pure data, and then they push that out to any user. But if you really start thinking about the persona, not every persona needs the same level of detail, and a KPI is not necessarily a KPI for the same persona. What could be a KPI for a sales rep in the field about hitting their coverage target, that's one of their main KPIs, is not a KPI for the sales director, right? They would mostly look at their net sales number versus their target. And understanding that level of detail that's relevant to the user and the key metrics, how they measure whether they're achieving their objectives, that gives you very much the relevance, and whether it should draw attention to a certain area. And then finally, you start to understand what levers have they got to achieve their objectives. So the sales director might think about how to allocate budget to certain promotion channels, or field force, or the targeting. So those are the levers of a sales director at that level for a sales rep. It's much more about, who am I going to connect with, visit, or who am I going to engage with, and where do I focus my effort. And so because the actions are different, the levers are different. It also means that how you present the same data is different.
Now, David, I can see you nodding along there, so I suspect you are in with a lot of those points.
I was thinking about, as you're speaking, that it kind of reminded me of a framework. It's jobs to be done, which is really aligned to that, because ultimately, the users don't care about a filter, or they don't care so much about what type of chart it is, right? It's about they're trying to go from A to B to try and have take an action. And I think we've seen this potentially earlier in other industries. I remember seeing, I worked in a company that they did a lot of segmentation and trying to provide almost in a call center a next best action. So someone would call the call center, and the call center, based on the customer experience, why they were calling, and their history. For instance, is it we should upgrade them, or we should give them free credit, or we should give them this offer or that offer? And it's almost a little bit kind of bringing that into analytics and going, okay, trying to understand what is the next thing that a user needs to do their job. And like you said, it's different audiences, different personas, or different needs. You can't just kind of paint everything with the same brush and go, like, everyone gets the same kind of treatment, because you have to. And I think we're finding that in our, like, outside of work lives, personalization is incredibly important in most of the things that we do. So how do we bring that to the business and going, it shouldn't be different. They should be able to kind of have that experience. So I think that I completely agree with some of the ideas that you're sharing.
And the interesting thing is that, when you start looking at how do you, there's all of the platforms now come with AI-enabled features and auto insight suggestions, and things like that. But a lot of that often is just not relevant to the user, because the platform doesn't have a concept of who the user is, and it doesn't have any knowledge of what is relevant. And yes, there is learning going on, but if you've got different users, the sales director, the sales rep, all using the same platform, and the platform doesn't distinguish, then what the platform learns is not going to be necessarily specific enough to be relevant for each of these user groups. And that's where, looking further forward, I think, what we are trying to do is start capturing those, those triangles of the personas, the metrics, and the dimensions, to capture what is relevant per persona. And then if we can then start using those personas to profile your user, based on what we know, that gives a helping hand to the AI, and drives much more relevance.
Now, David, you very, very briefly touched on this, just talking about the wider team. And I wanted to ask whether your team, or you specifically, work with other teams within data to help your data visualization to make a stronger product.
Yes, I think we wouldn't be able to kind of to deliver the right value if that wasn't the case. Whether that is working with data scientists or product managers to try to inform what we're building, particularly when it comes to challenges around different types of metrics, or metrics that are very similar but they have nuance in those. But also, of course, stakeholders and business partners. The business partners, it's an easier engagement because they have a want that they're trying to get to. But then a lot of the times there is a gap between the business side and then the execution and then the technical aspect of that. So we have data stewards to work with, or governance, to make sure that we all align. So when we call a metric and say this metric is X, we understand exactly what it is, and everyone is talking the same language.
I suppose same question to you as well, Axel. Are you working with all these other members of different teams across data?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also, if I look within our own team, we are part of the UX practice. So within our team, we've got a number of more technical people who will deliver the solution, but we also have people who are more focused on doing the user research and specifically the front end design. But apart from that, we work with the data engineering team, the MDM teams, to start looking at how can we build and enhance reusable data assets, because that's of course where a lot of, well, if not most of the effort is spent on any delivery, and there's a lot of scope for improvement and more efficiency, and of course the data scientist. And this is also an interesting challenge, because what we're trying to achieve is much more enabling business to do more themselves. But of course, that also is sort of a counterbalance with giving complete freedom to everyone to to start doing their own thing and duplicating, or maybe even higher risk activities. We have to know what data protection we need to have in place, or data, who's allowed to see which data. So there needs to be some level of control on that. But that's an interesting force field, and it's complex. I mean, it's not something we're going to solve in a year or even 2 years.
I think what's great is that you're both saying such positive things about how you're constantly addressing and readdressing what you're doing. And with that, obviously, comes the challenges. You've just touched on that very slightly. And big question here for those listening is, what would you say are the potential missteps that happen on this journey?
I can take.
Yeah,
I can take some of that initially. I think there's always challenges, particularly when it comes to tooling, where sometimes either you're trying to stretch a tool, or maybe there's not maturity in some of the tooling that you're trying to bring in. So I think sometimes those can be missteps, but also I think most companies are going through some stage of that, which is a lot of the changes in the data landscape, whether there is new data that's coming in which kind of enriches what you currently know, or whether you're migrating systems. Maybe some companies are going through a cloud migration. All of that sometimes can kind of hinder a lot of the progress, because you end up in a situation where you're trying to create business continuity in one side, but at the same time, you're changing a lot of the infrastructure and everything that kind of goes with it. And those two things sometimes can clash a little bit, because, of course, you have teams that want to move to, using cloud as an example, they want to move out of on-prem and they want to move to a cloud environment because of the advantages. But there's legacy products that are still in other parts of the business. And you almost have to kind of find ways of bringing those users with you without creating too much friction and distrust in the data. So I think that those are kind of the areas that I personally have seen that sometimes take a little bit more work.
Yeah, that's very recognizable. I think I would add also that what I've seen is, I mean, it's a typical journey to maturity. What I've seen for organizations moving from the classic BI, where you've got one data source and a set of reports on that data source, and those go out to the user. That each user has a multitude of reports. Then the visual analytics tools came in, and everyone thought, oh, this is great, because I can combine different data sources to bring everything to the fingertips of the user. And usually the result of that was that people were delivering monoliths. So all of these different data sources at the lowest level of detail, bring that in the typically in-memory tools for all users. And that's almost in every case a disaster, because for the user, it's a terrible experience. Well, for one, because it's just too much detail, it's too much going on, so it doesn't perform. And B, there's too much going on, and there's too much detail, and too much that is not relevant for you, because it's designed to cover something for everyone. And as a result, that usually gets, then usually people blame the tool. So either people start looking for a different tool or completely change the approach. But normally what you then should be doing is breaking down that monolith by one application per user persona, because then you can provide the right level of detail that's relevant for the user and design it in a way that's relevant for the context and the actions that the user would take, which usually means a smaller slice of the data and the right level of aggregation, which means you've got a much smoother performance and also less going on. So it's much nicer per persona. But the thing is, you have to invest and want to invest to deliver for each persona the right experience.
Yeah, and I would add one thing that I'm sure that also comes up, which is cost. These things are not free, right? Replicating these things across, like you said, almost replicating full databases in the BI tool. There is the cost of computing that, even though most users don't see that, but for an infrastructure team, that's a cost on the P&L that needs to be justified. So there's almost this need for users to be cognizant of the way that they are using the company resources and the ability of kind of using this all of those tools. I think there's a lot of advantage, particularly as you get to cloud, but it has different ways that you need to look at it. They need to take into account whether you're clustering, whether you're partitioning data, and making sure that you have the right practices in place, because that otherwise it can become a little bit of a wild west.
I mean, it definitely sounds like you always need to have your eyes on almost every aspect surrounding what you do. And I think that's so insightful to know that you are paying so much attention to the user as much you are your own roles. I'm sure I hope you would agree that is the case. Getting some good nods there. Unfortunately, we are reaching the end of this discussion, and I have to admit it's been such a valuable discussion as part of this wider festival. So I want to thank you both for joining me. I also want to thank our audience. But I will say, don't leave that soon, because we do have more coming to the festival. So whilst I say thank you to both David and Axel, I will say stick around for the festival and see what else we have in store.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.